The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins is one of the most debated books on religion and the existence of God, and given the influence of Dawkins' work, it is not surprising that it has faced rigorous criticism from theists, philosophers, and scholars. A critique of the God Delusion by Zain Mankani is one such response, offering a methodical rebuttal to Dawkins' claims. What sets Mankani's work apart is its focus on logical consistency, philosophical argumentation, and an insistence on challenging Dawkins on his own terms. Mankani's book is not an attempt to prove the existence of God, but it is rather a critique of Dawkins' arguments, and the author clarifies this from the outset, stating that his goal is to expose the flaws in Dawkins' reasoning rather than offer independent theological arguments. As he puts it, a book that is clearly grounded in prejudice and ignores rational proofs cannot be termed a scientific work. The critique follows the structure of The God Delusion, addressing each chapter in order and systematically deconstructing Dawkins' claims. In the same way, this video is not meant as a proof of God's existence but as a review or perhaps a summary of this work by Zain Mankani, and in later videos we'll be going through the book chapter by chapter and review some arguments in detail. I found this book to be a well-reasoned and engaging critique. While Dawkins writes with an air of absolute certainty, Mankani exposes how much of his argumentation is based on misrepresentation of theology and philosophy. That said, the strength of his logical analysis and the clarity of his arguments makes this an essential read for those interested in a balanced perspective on the debate between theism and atheism. Mankani begins by critiquing Dawkins' approach to religion, particularly his claim that his book is based on scientific objectivity. Dawkins argues that religious belief is a scientific hypothesis that can be tested and falsified. However, Mankani challenges this notion by pointing out that science, in its true essence, is limited to the material and the empirical, whereas religion deals with metaphysical realities. And he argues that Dawkins fails to acknowledge the epistemological limitations of science, particularly in matters of metaphysics and ultimate causes. As Mankani writes, science is defined by objectivity and rationality and relies on empirical proof. A book that is clearly grounded in prejudice and ignores rational proofs cannot be termed a scientific work. Moreover, in a post-positivist world, one must be cognizant of the fact that empirical evidence is not always quantitative, but it may be qualitative as well. Hence, to view the world in a purely positivist way and to ignore qualitative evidence is in itself a sign of regression and rejection of reality. It is these factors that make Dawkins' book unscientific, as the reader will surely affirm. One of Dawkins' central claims is that religious belief is a form of delusion, an irrational mental state unsupported by evidence. He suggests that people remain religious either because of social conditioning or due to intellectual dishonesty. Mankani counters this by highlighting that religious belief has been defended by some of history's greatest philosophers, all of whom provided rational arguments for God's existence. Dawkins dismisses these arguments without engaging with them in depth, which is a major flaw in his critique. Dawkins also presents 4 reasons why people might want to leave religion. First, they are unhappy in the religion they were brought up in. Second, they no longer believe in it. Third, they are disturbed by evils done in its name. And fourth, they feel vague yearnings to leave their faith. The author deconstructs these claims, pointing out that they rely on oversimplified assumptions. Regarding the first category, Dawkins assumes that religion exists to provide happiness and that if someone is unhappy in their faith, they should abandon it. However, Mankani refutes this by noting that religious truth is independent of personal happiness, and he argues that prophets and saints throughout history endured immense suffering in pursuit of divine truth, which suggests that faith is not merely about emotional satisfaction. Coming to the second category, those who are skeptical of religious tenets, Dawkins suggests that skepticism should inevitably lead to atheism. However, Mankani argues that skepticism is an integral part of faith, not a reason to abandon it, and he points out that the Quran itself encourages questioning and critical thinking. In critiquing Dawkins' third category, those disturbed by religious violence, The author highlights the inconsistency of using historical atrocities as an argument against religion. If violence committed in the name of faith invalidates religion, then by the same logic, the mass killings committed by atheistic regimes should invalidate atheism. Dawkins, however, attempts to excuse such atrocities by arguing that atheism was not the motivating factor, whereas he attributes all religious violence directly to belief systems. This double standard, Mankani argues, reveals the weakness of Dawkins' argument. Finally, regarding the fourth category, those with vague yearnings or vague desires to leave their faith, Mankani questions whether vague impulses are a sufficient basis for such a major life decision. He draws an analogy. If a person has a vague yearning to leave their family and live in isolation far away in the mountains, should they act on it without careful consideration? Dawkins, he argues, fails to account for the depth of religious experience and the intellectual engagement many believers have with their faith. Mankani also critiques Dawkins' argument regarding the supposed evolution of God. In chapter 2 of the original book, Dawkins states, "Any creative intelligence of sufficient complexity to design anything comes into existence only as the end product of an extended process of gradual evolution. Creative intelligences, being evolved, necessarily arrive late in the universe and therefore cannot be responsible for designing it. God, in this sense defined, is a delusion." Mankani dissects this claim, showing that Dawkins mistakenly applies biological principles to metaphysics. The concept of God as a necessary being is not one of an evolved intelligence but of a self-existent reality. By imposing evolutionary constraints on God, Dawkins fails to engage with classical theistic arguments that posit God as the ultimate source of existence beyond time and contingency. As Mankani writes, Dawkins insists on God being an effect of the universe and then denies God on the grounds that an effect cannot be its own cause. But why insist on God being an effect of the universe? Because evolution. It is really that simple for Dawkins. There is only one undeniable truth, one deity, and that is Darwinism. And even God must submit to this deity. He must concede to being an evolved entity who came into being and subsequently acquired intelligence and creativity as a result of the process of evolution and therefore could not have created the universe in the first place. Dawkins' rejection of the non-overlapping magisteria principle is also addressed. Dawkins dismisses Noma on the grounds that a universe with a supernatural creator is fundamentally different from one without, and therefore religion makes claims that science can evaluate. However, the author here responds that Dawkins does not account for the philosophical distinction between contingent and necessary existence. He writes, "The difference between a universe with God and a universe without one is that a universe without God does not and cannot exist. This is because the universe is composite, and whatever is composite is contingent. And whatever is contingent ultimately requires a simple, actualized, necessary being to bring it into existence." Mankani also addresses Dawkins' contradictory statements about his scope of criticism. Dawkins writes, "I am not attacking any particular version of God or gods. I am attacking God, all gods, anything and everything supernatural, wherever and whenever they have been or will be invented." Yet, shortly after he states, "Unless otherwise stated, I shall have Christianity mostly in mind, but only because it is the version with which I happen to be most familiar." Mankani highlights this inconsistency, arguing that Dawkins' focus on Christianity weakens his claim to be addressing theism in general. By failing to engage with Islamic, Jewish, or Hindu conceptions of God, Dawkins overlooks significant theological traditions, making his critique far less comprehensive than he claims. The author further critiques Dawkins' rejection of rational proofs for God's existence. In The God Delusion, Dawkins attempts to refute classical arguments for God, particularly those put forward by St. Thomas Aquinas. However, his rebuttals are often simplistic and fail to engage with the depth of the original arguments. Dawkins writes, "They make an entirely unwarranted assumption that God himself is immune to the regress. If everything has a cause, then what caused God?" Mankani identifies this as a fundamental misrepresentation. The argument from contingency does not claim that everything has a cause. Rather, it asserts that everything that undergoes change must have a cause. A necessary being, by definition, does not require a cause because it does not undergo change. Dawkins, Mankani argues, sets up a straw man by mischaracterizing the argument, then refutes a version of it that no serious philosopher has ever put forward. Dawkins also attempts to dismantle religious belief by reducing it to evolutionary origins. He argues that religion is a byproduct of evolutionary processes, suggesting that belief in God arose as an adaptive mechanism rather than as a response to objective truth. While this is an interesting hypothesis, Mankani highlights that it does not logically follow that religion is therefore false. Even if religious belief had an evolutionary origin, that would not disprove the existence of God. As Mankani notes, evolution may explain why humans have religious inclinations, but it does not explain away the existence of God any more than our perception of the physical world negates its reality. Dawkins further argues that religious morality is unnecessary because moral behavior can be explained through Darwinism and Darwinian mechanisms such as kin selection and reciprocal altruism. He then provides four evolutionary explanations for moral behavior. The first being genetic kinship, whereby individuals favor their relatives because they share genes. Then comes reciprocal altruism, where cooperation benefits survival. Then acquiring a reputation for generosity, where social standing improves reproductive success. And lastly, conspicuous generosity, where public displays of kindness act as a form of self promotion. Mankani challenges this account, arguing that Dawkins conflates social pragmatism with genuine moral obligation. Evolutionary benefits may explain why certain behaviors persist, but they do not provide a foundation for why individuals should act morally. Moreover, he points out that many religious moral principles go against evolutionary incentives. Religious ethics often demand self sacrifice, humility, and care for strangers, values that do not necessarily offer evolutionary advantages. For instance, prophets and saints have historically stood for moral truths at great personal cost, often facing exile, persecution, or even execution. Such actions are difficult to explain within a framework that views morality purely in terms of genetic advantage. To further illustrate this, Mankani discusses Dawkins' treatment of the famous trolley problem, a moral thought experiment used in ethical philosophy. Dawkins argues that atheists and religious believers provide similar responses to moral dilemmas, suggesting that morality is independent of religious belief. However, Mankani counters that these experiments measure moral instincts, not moral philosophy, and that a believer could argue that humans were created with an innate moral compass, which religion clarifies and refines. Dawkins, on the other hand, assumes that morality must be entirely socially constructed, failing to recognize that religion provides a framework for moral reasoning beyond instinctive impulses. The author then also critiques Dawkins' treatment of scripture, particularly his tendency to take religious texts out of context. Dawkins claims that the Old Testament promotes ethnic cleansing, citing verses where God commands the Israelites to wage war. However, Mankani points out that these passages must be understood in their historical and theological context. He notes that similar moral dilemmas exist in secular history, such as just war theory and the ethics of self defense, but Dawkins does not apply the same scrutiny to secular ethical frameworks. Furthermore, Mankani emphasizes that Islamic teachings explicitly prohibit indiscriminate violence while quoting verses from the Quran, and argues that such verses contradict Dawkins' assertion that religious texts inherently promote violence. Dawkins' discussion of religious fundamentalism is another key area of critique. He argues that even moderate religious belief is dangerous because it enables extremism. Mankani counters that this argument is a classic case of guilt by association, and just as not all political ideologies lead to tyranny, not all religious beliefs lead to extremism. To claim that moderate faith enables extremism is as irrational as arguing that peaceful political activism enables terrorism. The fact that some people misuse religion does not invalidate religion itself. Mankani continues his critique by addressing Dawkins' views on religious law and moral absolutism, and one of the most controversial sections is Dawkins' discussion of blasphemy and apostasy laws, particularly in Islamic countries. Dawkins presents these laws as evidence that religion is oppressive and incompatible with human rights. Mankani acknowledges that certain countries have harsh blasphemy laws, but argues that Dawkins fails to differentiate between religious teachings and political misuse of religion. He notes that most Muslim majority countries do not implement the death penalty for blasphemy and that the legal frameworks for such laws were often influenced by colonial policies rather than religious doctrine. The author also highlights that Dawkins ignores historical nuances when discussing apostasy. Dawkins claims that apostasy laws exist purely to suppress dissent, but Mankani argues that these laws historically applied to acts of treason rather than personal belief. Dawkins argues that religious morality is not based on tangible consequences, but rather on subjective preferences, particularly of the Christian majority. And he claims that religious people oppose certain private thoughts and actions, such as homosexuality, not because they cause harm, but because they personally disapprove of them. According to Dawkins, this shows that religious morality is arbitrary and not grounded in rational ethical principles. The critique counters this by arguing that private actions inevitably influence public life and policy, making them a legitimate concern for the majority. It asserts that homosexuality is not just opposed by religion but also by evolutionary principles, as persistent homosexuality would lead to species extinction. Furthermore, it claims that movements advocating inclusivity, such as Drag Queen Story Hour and LGBTQ themed books in schools, go beyond promoting tolerance and instead actively push radical ideological agendas. Dawkins' discussion of abortion is another area where Mankani finds major weaknesses. Dawkins argues that opposition to abortion is based purely on religious dogma and that there is no rational reason to consider an embryo a human life. He claims that many religious people who strongly oppose abortion are paradoxically supportive of taking adult lives, such as through capital punishment. He does not distinguish between different types of killing, treating the death penalty and abortion as morally comparable. His position appears to be driven by his atheism and anti-religious stance rather than a neutral ethical evaluation. One of Dawkins' key arguments is that an embryo does not suffer in the same way that an adult or even an animal does. He believes that the extent of suffering, rather than human identity, should determine the morality of taking a life. However, he acknowledges that suffering is difficult to measure. Mankani challenges Dawkins' position by arguing that his reason is inconsistent and reductionist. It points out that rejecting abortion on the basis that it deprives a potential human life is not equivalent to opposing contraception or even resisting rape, as Dawkins suggests. Additionally, the critique argues that prioritizing suffering above all else as a moral standard leads to dangerous consequences, potentially undermining family values, normalizing transgressive behaviors, and opening the door to ethical justifications for acts like cannibalism. It concludes that Dawkins does not adequately justify why suffering should be the ultimate moral determinant. Dawkins' broader argument against religious ethics is that morality should be based purely on human well-being rather than divine commandments. He advocates for a consequentialist approach, arguing that actions should be judged solely by their outcomes rather than by adherence to religious doctrine. Mankani challenges this claim by arguing that consequentialism itself is deeply flawed. He points out that a morality based purely on outcomes can justify immoral actions if they produce desirable results. For example, if lying or manipulation leads to overall happiness, then consequentialism cannot consistently condemn such behavior. Further, the author critiques Dawkins' understanding of empirical evidence. Dawkins demands material proof of God's existence, yet he accepts scientific theories based on indirect inference. For instance, scientists infer the existence of dark matter from its gravitational effects, despite never directly observing it. This serves as an analogy for recognizing the existence of things based on their effects rather than direct observation. The argument extends to the possibility of material objects in the universe remaining undetectable due to human limitations and questions why the same logic cannot apply to the existence of a creator. The author critiques Dawkins for prematurely dismissing the existence of God while admitting that science may eventually develop ways to detect currently unseen entities. Now, a final area where Mankani critiques Dawkins is his discussion of evolution and its implications for theism. Dawkins argues that evolution eliminates the need for God by providing a natural explanation for complexity, and Mankani responds that while evolution explains biological processes, it does not address the ultimate question of why anything exists at all. Dawkins confuses mechanisms with origins. Evolution explains how life develops, but it does not explain why there is something rather than nothing. He also highlights that many religious thinkers accept evolution without abandoning belief in God. The idea that evolution and theism are mutually exclusive is a false dichotomy, and that evolution could potentially be a tool or a mechanism put in place by God, which should further be researched without making it seem like religion and science always have to be adversaries. Throughout his critique, Mankani effectively exposes Dawkins' selective reasoning, misrepresentations, and contradictions. While Dawkins claims to be arguing from a position of reason and evidence, his approach often relies on rhetorical attacks rather than serious engagement with opposing views. By systematically addressing these flaws, Mankani provides a strong case that the God delusion is not the definitive argument against God that it claims to be. Now, having examined Mankani's response to Dawkins' arguments, Mankani succeeds in exposing the weaknesses in Dawkins' reasoning, particularly his tendency to misrepresent religious concepts, dismiss philosophical arguments without proper engagement, and apply double standards when discussing evidence. Dawkins' portrayal of religion is often superficial, reducing complex theological and philosophical traditions to straw man. Mankani systematically dismantles these arguments, demonstrating that Dawkins' work is more polemical than scholarly. One of the book's greatest strengths is its logical clarity. Mankani does not merely offer a religious rebuttal to Dawkins, but engages with his claims on philosophical and rational grounds. He shows that Dawkins' argument against God is not as scientifically rigorous as he presents it to be. Instead, it is based on materialist assumptions that are themselves unproven. Another major strength is the book's systematic structure. By responding to each of Dawkins' chapters in order, Mankani ensures that no major argument is left unaddressed. It does not merely pick apart minor flaws but directly engages with Dawkins' most significant claims, including the supposed incompatibility of science and religion, the origins of morality, and the problem of religious violence. His critique is thorough, detailed, and well researched. And this book is recommended for anyone interested in the philosophy of religion, whether believer or skeptic, as it challenges one to think critically about both atheism and theism. If nothing else, it shows that the question of God is far from settled, and that intellectual honesty demands more than simply declaring religion a delusion.